Donald Trump arrived 47 minutes late to the most consequential bilateral meeting of the entire US-Canada trade confrontation. The meeting that was supposed to produce a framework for resolution. The meeting that every allied government, every trade analyst, and every diplomatic corps across the Western world had been watching as the potential inflection point in a conflict that had consumed two governments for the better part of 2 years. The meeting that both sides had spent weeks building toward, advanced teams negotiating every element of the agenda, position papers submitted and reviewed on both sides, legal frameworks drafted and revised, economic models run and run again. He arrived 47 minutes late, and the room was empty. The chairs had been pushed back from the table. The briefing documents had been collected and packed. The Canadian flags had been removed from their stands. The coffee sitting in its service had gone cold. The place settings on both sides of the table were untouched. And Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, the leader Trump had deliberately kept waiting for 47 minutes as a choreographed display of hierarchical dominance, was standing at a podium 6 blocks away, delivering a press conference that has since been viewed more times than any statement by a Canadian Prime Minister in recorded history. He was not discussing the meeting. He was explaining why the meeting would not be taking place, and the explanation was 7 words that have since appeared in diplomatic protocol textbooks, negotiation seminars, and analytical frameworks, examining what occurs when a leader of a smaller nation decides that self-respect is not a variable subject to negotiation, even when the counterparty is the President of the United States. The photograph of the empty room appeared on the front page of every major international newspaper the following morning. 12 chairs pushed back from a long conference table, 6 place settings on each side, completely untouched. 2 small American flags still standing in their holders at the center of the table, the Canadian flags absent, removed by the departing delegation with deliberate precision. The removal was not an oversight. It was an instruction. When a diplomatic delegation removes its national flags from a meeting table, the signal transmitted is unambiguous to every trained observer in international relations. This meeting is not paused. It is not deferred to another date. It is concluded. The flags do not return until the conditions for re-engagement have been established. And the conditions, as Carney would explain from his podium, had not been met. Warren Buffett called it the most significant negotiation lesson delivered on the world stage in his lifetime. He said Carney had demonstrated something that the majority of people in business, in politics, and in daily life never fully absorb until they have already paid the price of not knowing it. That the most powerful position available in any negotiation is not what you say once you are in the room. It is your genuine willingness to leave it, not the performance of that willingness, not the threat of it, the action, because threats can be manufactured without cost. Walking out cannot. But here is what Carney actually said. 7 words delivered at a podium with a single Canadian flag positioned behind him, without notes, without visible anger, without any outward indication that he had just done something no allied leader had done to a sitting American president in the modern era of international diplomacy. When you understand what those 7 words were, why they were selected with the precision of a man who spent 3 decades at 2 of the world's most influential central banks, choosing language that moves markets, what happened minute by minute inside that conference room during the 47 minutes of waiting, what Carney said privately to his delegation at the exact moment he made his decision, and what Buffett explained about the categorical difference between a leader who threatens to leave and a leader who actually does, you will understand why this was not a diplomatic incident. This was the moment the power dynamic between the United States and Canada changed in a way that cannot be reversed by a subsequent meeting, a subsequent concession, or a subsequent press release. And it changed not because of a policy shift, not because of a trade framework, not because of any economic mechanism. It changed because one man stood up, took his delegation with him, and walked through a door. Subscribe now, because the diplomatic consequences of that walkout are compounding across every American bilateral relationship on Earth. Two allied leaders have already cited it as precedent in their own dealings with Washington, and the White House has not been able to schedule a replacement meeting because the conditions Carney established for returning to the table have not been satisfied. Let me take you through exactly what this meeting was designed to be, because understanding the stakes is what makes walking out a calculation rather than a reaction. The bilateral summit had been assembled across more than 3 weeks of preliminary negotiation. Both governments had agreed to a formal session between the two leaders aimed at establishing what diplomats were describing as a resolution framework, not a final agreement, but a structured architecture for how the two sides would begin unwinding the trade conflict that had defined their relationship for 2 years. The agenda spanned tariff reduction timelines, pipeline access normalization, critical mineral trade terms, agricultural market access provisions, and a regulatory harmonization protocol. Every item on the agenda had been pre-negotiated by advanced teams working in both capitals. Every item had preliminary position papers from both sides. The meeting was not exploratory in nature. It was designed to be confirmatory. The difficult work had been completed in the weeks preceding the session. The two leaders were supposed to sit across from each other, review the framework their teams had assembled, and provide the political authorization that would allow implementation to begin. Every allied government was paying close attention. NATO partners had been briefed on the agenda. The European Union had formally registered its interest in the outcome because the US-Canada framework was expected to function as a template for addressing similar American trade conflicts with European nations. Japan's trade ministry had been in direct communication with both Ottawa and Washington about potential parallels to its own ongoing disputes with Washington. Financial markets had already priced in a meaningful probability of resolution. The Canadian dollar had strengthened slightly in the week before the meeting on expectations of a constructive outcome. The meeting was not a photo opportunity. It was the hinge point, the moment where the confrontation either began its resolution or calcified into permanent structural divergence. And Carney had already made a significant concession just to secure the session. The meeting was held on neutral ground at a diplomatic facility in a third country. But the format, the agenda structure, and the procedural framework all reflected preferences of the American side. Carney had accepted those terms because the substance was more important than the staging. He had traveled. He had prepared. He had demonstrated flexibility on every element that could be negotiated. The one element that was not available for negotiation was whether he would be treated as an equal when he arrived. Lateness in diplomacy is never accidental. It is never traffic. It is never a scheduling overrun that compounded unexpectedly. It is one of the oldest, most thoroughly documented, and most deliberately employed instruments of dominance in the entire history of international relations. Causing another leader to wait establishes a hierarchy before a single spoken word exchanges hands. My time is more valuable than yours. My schedule supersedes yours. You require this meeting more than I do. Every additional minute past the scheduled start time reinforces the power gradient. The waiting party must remain physically present, maintain composure, manage their delegation's growing discomfort, monitor their watch without visible agitation, and suppress any outward signal of frustration, all while the absent party is elsewhere, unhurried, demonstrating through their physical absence that the other party's time is a resource they feel entitled to consume. The historical record is extensive and consistent. Vladimir Putin kept Queen Elizabeth waiting 14 minutes during a 2003 meeting, a delay universally interpreted as a deliberate assertion of Russian equivalence with British royal authority. Putin kept Angela Merkel waiting more than 4 hours during the Ukraine crisis negotiations in 2014, a demonstration so aggressive that Merkel's own staff described it as psychological warfare conducted before any substantive discussion had begun. Mao Zedong kept Henry Kissinger waiting during the 1971 opening to China. De Gaulle kept nearly everyone waiting as a matter of institutional principle. The practice is as old as the diplomatic tradition itself, and its psychology is as straightforward as it is effective. The party that controls the clock controls the frame. Arrival time communicates hierarchy. The party that waits is the petitioner. The party that arrives at their own discretion is the authority. Trump had deployed lateness as a systematic tool across his presidency. NATO summits where allied leaders occupied conference rooms checking their watches while motorcades moved slowly across the Capitol. Bilateral meetings where visiting heads of state were held in waiting rooms with their delegations surrounded by the furniture and flags of a power that had not yet chosen to arrive. G7 sessions where the scheduled start time was treated as an approximate suggestion. The pattern was documented, analyzed, and completely understood by every diplomatic corps in the world. Lateness was not a personality characteristic. It was not disorganization. It was a strategy, designed to establish before the first handshake, before the first exchange, who holds authority and who is requesting attention. And the strategy worked. It had worked without exception for years. It worked because people stayed. The accumulated investment of having traveled, prepared, and arranged the meeting made departure feel irrational. The issues were too important. The opportunity was too rare. The political cost of leaving appeared higher than the indignity of absorbing the wait. So leaders waited. They processed the delay. They offered a composed smile when the late party finally appeared. They proceeded as though the deliberate disrespect had not registered. And in proceeding, they accepted. They established for the record that they would tolerate being treated as subordinate, that their time could be wasted, that the hierarchy the lateness was designed to transmit had been received and internalized. Trump had used this approach with more than a dozen world leaders. It had worked every single time. Every leader had waited. Every leader had absorbed the delay and continued the meeting as though the preceding hour had contained nothing of significance. Until Carney. The Canadian delegation arrived at 9:47 a.m., 13 minutes ahead of the scheduled start. Standard diplomatic protocol calls for arriving 10 to 15 minutes early to allow for security processing, room orientation, document arrangement, and the small procedural rituals that communicate professionalism and institutional readiness. Carney's team was seated by 9:52. Documents arranged, water poured, briefing notes reviewed a final time. The Canadian ambassador confirmed the room configuration with host facility staff. Everything was protocol correct. At 10 a.m., the scheduled start time, the American delegation had not arrived. No concern at this stage. A 5 to 10 minute buffer is accepted as normal in diplomatic contexts. Security detail timing, motorcade sequencing, last-minute briefing adjustments can all produce minor delays that carry no diplomatic weight whatsoever. The Canadian delegation waited at ease. At 10:10, the Canadian ambassador made discreet contact with the American advance team stationed inside the building. He was told the president was on his way. Diplomatic language specifically engineered to communicate nothing. A placeholder phrase that purchases time without providing information. At 10:15, 15 minutes past the scheduled start, the atmosphere inside the room shifted. Not dramatically, subtly. The way a room shifts when the people in it begin to understand that what is occurring is not a delay, but a transmission. Aides exchanged glances. One member of the Canadian trade team quietly closed his briefing binder, a small gesture that communicated he had understood the wait would not be brief. Carney's expression did not change. He sat with both hands resting on the table in front of him, looking at the empty chairs across the table with the composure of a man who was not surprised by what was unfolding. At 10:20, Carney's chief of staff leaned toward him and asked quietly whether any updated arrival time had been received. None had. The chief of staff made a discreet call. No response from the American advance team. At 10:25, 25 minutes past the start, Carney asked his ambassador a direct question. The ambassador stepped out, made contact, returned, and shook his head. No updated estimated arrival time. No explanation for a delay of this magnitude. No acknowledgement from the American side that a gap of this length required any communication at all. The pattern was now unmistakable to everyone in the room. This was not traffic. This was not a security complication. This was not a logistical collision with another commitment. This was deliberate. And here is the part of the story that no camera captured, and that has only been partially reported. What happened inside the Canadian delegation between minute 25 and minute 35? The internal deliberation that determined everything that followed. Carney convened a quiet consultation, not a debate, not a vote, a structured discussion. He asked 3 questions. First, had the American side communicated any explanation for a delay of this length? The answer was no. Second, was there any security or logistical factor that could plausibly account for an unannounced gap of this duration? The answer was no. The American advance team had confirmed earlier that morning that the president's schedule was clear, and the motorcade route had been finalized without complications. Third, was there any documented precedent in the diplomatic record for an Allied leader waiting more than 30 minutes for a bilateral meeting with an American president and subsequently conducting a productive negotiation? His ambassador paused, then answered, no, not because the question had never been posed, but because no Allied leader had ever waited more than 30 minutes. The threshold had never been reached. Leaders either arrived within an acceptable margin of the scheduled time, or the meeting was formally rescheduled through diplomatic channels with advance notice. A 47-minute unannounced delay with no communication of any kind was without precedent in modern Allied diplomacy. Carney's chief of staff recommended holding until the 45-minute mark before making any decision. The reasoning was pragmatic. The meeting was too significant to abandon over a delay, however deliberate. The trade team lead agreed. The ambassador disagreed. He argued that every additional minute of waiting was being documented, photographed through the room's glass panels by press positioned in the corridor outside, and interpreted by every diplomatic mission monitoring the summit's progress. The longer they remained, the more the narrative solidified. Canada waited. Canada absorbed. Canada accepted the disrespect, because Canada needed the meeting more than it needed its own dignity. Carney listened to all 3 perspectives without interruption. Then he made the decision. Not at the 45-minute mark his chief of staff had recommended. Not at the 30-minute threshold his ambassador had identified. At minute 35, he looked at his delegation. 5 words. We're leaving. Pack everything up. The departure was not hurried. It contained no visible anger. It was methodical and composed. The delegation rose from their chairs. Documents were placed into briefcases. Folders were closed. The Canadian flags were lifted from their holders at the center of the table, folded according to established protocol, and placed in a carrying case. The flag removal was a specific instruction Carney gave directly. Leave everything else. Take the flags. The symbolism was precise, and every diplomat who subsequently analyzed the walkout identified it as the single most consequential gesture of the entire sequence. Removing national flags from a meeting table is the diplomatic equivalent of withdrawing an ambassador. It signals that the engagement is not suspended pending further discussion. It is concluded. The conditions for resumption have not been established. The delegation exited the room at approximately 10:40 a.m. They moved through the corridor past the International Press Corps stationed outside. Carney did not pause. He made no statement in the corridor. He did not make eye contact with the cameras as he passed. His pace was measured, not rushed, not artificially slow. The pace of a man who is not escaping a situation, but completing a decision he has already made. At 10:47 a.m., 47 minutes after the scheduled start, the President of the United States arrived at the meeting room. His delegation entered first. Two senior advisors walked through the door, stopped, and turned back toward the corridor. The room was empty. 12 chairs pushed back from the table, 6 place settings untouched on the American side, 6 cleared spaces where the Canadian settings had been arranged and then removed. 2 American flags still upright in their stands. 2 vacant holders where the Canadian flags had been. A White House photographer who had been positioned to capture the opening handshake captured something else entirely. The president standing in the doorway of an empty room. The image was not released by the White House. It was obtained by Reuters through a source inside the facility and published within the hour. The photograph became the single most reproduced image of the entire US-Canada confrontation to that point. 6 blocks away, at a location his advance team had quietly secured that morning as a contingency, Mark Carney stood at a podium with the Canadian flag positioned behind him. One flag, no American flag alongside it, no bilateral staging, no shared platform, just the flag of Canada and the man who had just walked out of a meeting with the most powerful leader on Earth. The press conference lasted 12 minutes. The first 11 were a composed, detailed account of Canada's position in the trade confrontation, the progress made through advanced team negotiations, and Canada's sustained willingness to engage bilaterally under conditions of mutual respect. He spoke the way he always spoke, precise, measured, the cadence of a central banker delivering a policy update to an audience of sophisticated observers. No visible anger, no accusation directed at any individual, no theatrical pauses or performative gestures. And then in the final minute, a journalist posed the question everyone in the room had been waiting for. Prime Minister, can you explain why you chose to leave the meeting before it began? Carney looked into the camera, not at the journalist, not at the assembled press, directly into the lens. The pause lasted 1 second, perhaps 2, the pause of someone who has already chosen their words and is simply placing them with care. And he said 7 words that were trending in 40 countries within 20 minutes, that were quoted on the floor of 3 national parliaments within 24 hours, that were cited in 2 separate NATO diplomatic briefings within 48 hours, and that have already been incorporated into the curriculum of at least 4 diplomatic institutions and 3 business school negotiation programs. Sovereign nations do not wait to be received. 7 words. No elaboration, no follow-up qualifier, no recounting of the minutes that had passed, no accusation directed at the president or the American delegation by name. He moved to the next question as though he had stated something so self-evident it required no supporting argument, the way a mathematician states an axiom, the way a physicist states a natural law, not a position, a fact. Sovereign nations do not wait to be received. The sentence contains no reference to Trump. It contains no reference to America. It does not describe the specific incident at all. It states a universal principle applicable to every nation, every leader, and every diplomatic engagement in history. And by stating it universally, it made the specific application completely undeniable. Everyone watching understood which sovereign nation had been kept waiting. Everyone understood by whom. And everyone understood that a principle, once stated publicly by a sitting head of government who had just acted on it, was no longer theoretical. It was operational. It had been tested. It had been executed. And the execution had been broadcast live to the world. The room understood. The cameras understood. The 40 countries where the phrase was trending within 20 minutes understood. Carney had taken the entire walkout, the 47 minutes of deliberate waiting, the deliberate disrespect, the empty room, the removed flags, the press conference held in place of the meeting, and compressed it into a single sentence that reframed every element through one organizing principle. This was not about scheduling. This was not about personal ego. This was not about a smaller country unable to absorb the pressure of dealing with a larger power. This was about whether sovereign nations accept being treated as subordinates. Carney's answer was no. And the answer was not delivered as a political argument or a negotiating posture. It was delivered as a statement of natural law. Sovereign nations do not wait to be received. They never have. They never should. And Canada, under this Prime Minister, will not. The global reaction moved faster and cut deeper than anything the White House had anticipated, because the walkout activated a sentiment that had been accumulating across every allied government for months. The shared frustration of being kept waiting. The accumulated weight of lateness deployed as a systematic tool at NATO summits, at G7 sessions, at bilateral meetings across 2 continents. 3 European heads of state issued statements within 24 hours, expressing support for what one described as the principle of mutual respect as a precondition for bilateral engagement. None named Trump directly. None referenced the specific incident explicitly. All were immediately understood by every diplomatic correspondent who read them. Japan's foreign minister made a public statement about punctuality as a reflection of sovereign regard between equal partners. Australia's prime minister, asked about the walkout at an unrelated press conference, said simply that respect for another nation's time is respect for that nation's sovereignty, a formulation every diplomatic reporter in the room recognized as a direct endorsement. 2 allied leaders facing upcoming bilateral meetings with Washington did something with no precedent in modern diplomatic practice. They publicly stated, through their foreign ministries, on the record, in language their own press corps and their own publics could hold them accountable to, that punctuality would function as a precondition for their meetings to proceed, not communicated privately through diplomatic backchannels where such conditions could be negotiated away or quietly ignored, publicly stated. The tactic of deliberate lateness, which had functioned without failure for years, was now neutralized, not by counter-tactic, not by retaliation, by precedent. Carney had demonstrated that walking out was survivable, that the immediate political cost was manageable, that the global reaction would be overwhelmingly supportive rather than critical, and that the leader who walked out would be regarded not as impulsive or fragile, but as principled and composed. The cost-benefit calculation that had kept every previous leader seated, the calculation that said absorbing the indignity of waiting was less expensive than the disruption of leaving, had been permanently altered by a single data point. One leader walked out. The world applauded. Walking out was now a viable option, and a viable option is one that must be accounted for. Trump could no longer assume that lateness would be absorbed without consequence. And a dominance instrument that might fail is a dominance instrument that cannot be deployed safely. The White House spent 48 hours cycling through potential responses and discovering that every available option created more complications than it resolved. The first instinct was dismissal, characterize the walkout as an overreaction, frame Carney as too emotional to handle the pressure of negotiating with a superpower, suggest he was looking for an excuse to avoid a meeting he anticipated losing. The communications team drafted 3 versions of this response and rejected all of them, because the footage of Carney's press conference, composed, clinical, completely without emotional charge, the furthest thing from an overreaction that any public statement could possibly be, made the characterization impossible to sustain. Anyone who watched the clip would see a man in complete institutional control, delivering a principle with the composure of a senior jurist reading a ruling. Calling that emotional was not merely inaccurate, it was strategically counterproductive. It would direct people to the footage, and the footage would disprove the characterization immediately. The second instinct was to manufacture an explanation, claim the delay resulted from a security complication or an unavoidable scheduling conflict, something routine and blameless. The advance team confirmed that no such issue existed, and fabricating one would require documentation that would eventually be contradicted by the facility's own operational logs. the motorcade records, and the direct testimony of dozens of staff members with first-hand knowledge of the president's schedule that morning. The third instinct was retaliation, tariff escalation, trade consequences, diplomatic punishment for the walkout itself. But retaliating against a leader who had walked out of a room because you arrived 47 minutes late was the one response that every communications advisor, every political strategist, and every diplomatic consultant involved unanimously agreed would be catastrophic. Retaliation confirmed everything. It confirmed the lateness was deliberate. It confirmed the walkout was justified. It confirmed the disrespect was real. And it established that the response to a demand for basic respect was punishment, transforming the narrative permanently from scheduling dispute into president retaliates against ally for refusing to be treated as subordinate. The White House chose silence, and silence in this specific context was its own form of confirmation. A president who had been genuinely wronged by an ally's departure would say so. A president who had been exposed using lateness as a dominance instrument and lost control of the outcome has nothing credible to say. Then Warren Buffett offered his analysis, and what he said reframed the entire exchange from a diplomatic incident into a master class on the single most determinative principle in the entire discipline of negotiation. In 60 years of executing transactions, Buffett said, I have learned one thing that carries more weight than every other lesson accumulated across all of those years. The most powerful position available in any negotiation is the genuine, demonstrated willingness to walk away, not the performance of that willingness, not the stated threat of it. Threats are common. Threats are inexpensive to produce. Every party in every negotiation makes some version of the threat to walk away. The only question that matters is whether the threat is real. And the only way to determine whether it is real is to observe what happens when the actual moment arrives. Most people, when the moment arrives, stay. They stay because the deal feels too significant to abandon. Because the accumulated investment and preparation feels too large to walk away from. Because the fear of what follows departure feels greater than the discomfort of what follows staying. And every time they stay, they teach the other party that the threat was manufactured, that walking away is not a genuine option, that the stated position can be disregarded. Carney did not threaten, he did not perform willingness to leave, he left, and in leaving, he accomplished something that no quantity of negotiating skill or rhetorical preparation could have produced inside that conference room. He demonstrated that Canada does not value the meeting more than it values its dignity, and a party that places dignity above the deal cannot be pressured, cannot be manipulated, and cannot be kept waiting, because the tactic of delay only functions against someone who is unwilling to leave. And Carney demonstrated on the largest diplomatic stage available that he is not that person. Buffett introduced what he called need asymmetry. Every negotiation, he explained, contains a concealed variable that determines the eventual outcome before a single word is exchanged across the table. Who needs the agreement more? The party with greater need will wait, will absorb delays, will tolerate disrespect, will make concessions to preserve the process, will internalize indignities because the alternative, no agreement, feels worse than the indignity itself. The party with lesser need holds all of the structural leverage, not because of the quality of their arguments, not because of their economic scale, not because of their military or political power, because they can leave. And leaving is the one action that no amount of preparation, power, or political leverage on the opposing side can prevent or reverse. Trump's deliberate lateness was a diagnostic test of need asymmetry. It was designed to compel Carney to reveal, through the act of remaining seated and waiting, that Canada required the meeting more than America did. That Canada would absorb the delay because no realistic alternative existed. Carney's walkout answered the test, but it answered it in the opposite direction from what the test was designed to produce. By leaving, Carney demonstrated that Canada had constructed real alternatives, that this particular meeting was not Canada's only available path forward, that 18 months of trade diversification, Commonwealth partnership development, and alternative economic architecture had reduced Canada's dependence on an American agreement to the point where institutional dignity carried more value than the negotiation itself. And that answer, once demonstrated publicly and irreversibly on camera, cannot be undone by any subsequent statement, meeting, or concession. Every future engagement between these two governments will begin from the established fact that Canada's walkaway point is real and has been executed, and that fact changes every subsequent calculation. Buffett drew a parallel that reframed the exchange in historical terms. He said he had watched this exact dynamic unfold once before on the world stage, and the consequence had reshaped international relations for an entire generation. In October 1986, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev met in Reykjavik, Iceland, for a summit on nuclear arms reduction. The two leaders came closer to a comprehensive disarmament agreement than anyone had previously considered possible, discussing the elimination of entire categories of nuclear weapons in a single session. The world was watching. The stakes could not have been higher. Then Gorbachev attached a condition. He insisted that any agreement be linked to restrictions on the Strategic Defense Initiative, Reagan's missile defense program. Reagan could not accept the condition, and Reagan did something his own advisors had argued against. He stood up, said this was as far as he was able to go, and walked out. The summit ended without an agreement. The press characterized it as a failure. Analysts predicted a renewed freeze in U.S.-Soviet relations. Gorbachev's team described the walkout as reckless. Reagan's own party was divided on whether the decision had been correct. Within 2 years, Gorbachev came back to the table and signed the INF Treaty on terms substantially closer to Reagan's original position than to the conditions he had insisted on at Reykjavik, without the SDI restriction he had demanded as the price of agreement. The walkout did not merely preserve Reagan's position, it improved it, because the walkout communicated something that months of formal negotiation had failed to establish: that Reagan's stated limit was real, that a point existed beyond which the American president would not move under any combination of pressure, diplomatic momentum, or historical opportunity. Gorbachev understood after Reykjavik that future negotiations would need to function within Reagan's actual constraints rather than attempting to reposition them. The walkout did not end the relationship. It clarified it, and clarity in negotiation is the precondition for genuine progress. Buffett connected the parallel precisely. Carney did what Reagan did in 1986. He walked out of a session with the most powerful counterpart available to him. He absorbed the immediate cost, the headlines, the uncertainty, the criticism from voices who preferred accommodation, and he established something that will shape every future engagement between these two governments: that Canada's walkaway point is real, that the willingness to leave is not a performance, that the next time the United States sits across from Canada, the American side will know, with documented certainty, that the Canadian side will stand up and leave if the conditions are not met. And that knowledge, Buffett said, is worth more than any tariff reduction, any market access provision, or any framework agreement the original meeting could have produced, because it changes the fundamental character of every future negotiation, from one where the larger party sets terms the smaller party absorbs, to one where both parties must engage in genuine reciprocal negotiation. For a nation 1/10 the economic scale of its counterpart, genuine reciprocal negotiation is the most valuable outcome any diplomatic exchange could produce. Buffett's closing carried the weight of someone who has occupied every position at every type of negotiating table across 6 decades. Every person who has ever negotiated anything, he said, a business transaction, a salary, a contract, a personal relationship, has faced the identical moment Carney faced in that room. The moment where you must decide whether the deal is worth more than your self-respect, whether staying is more intelligent than leaving, whether the pragmatic choice is superior to the principled one. And most people, most of the time, make the pragmatic choice. They stay. They absorb the delay, the disrespect, the unfavorable terms, because the deal feels important and departure feels risky. And sometimes that is the correct decision. But here is what I have learned across 60 years of watching people negotiate. The people who are genuinely willing to leave, not performing willingness, but possessing it as a real operational capacity, consistently achieve better outcomes than everyone else. Not because they are more forceful or more intelligent, because the other side senses it. The other side understands within minutes of sitting down whether the person across the table will walk away if necessary. When they know you will, the entire dynamic changes, terms improve, respect increases, delays stop, because disrespecting someone who will leave is a risk that no rational negotiator accepts. Carney walked out, and every future meeting with Canada will start on time. And arriving on time, after what happened in that empty room, is itself the first concession. So here is where things stand. Donald Trump arrived 47 minutes late to the most significant bilateral meeting of the US-Canada trade confrontation. The delay was deliberate. No security issue, no scheduling collision, no explanation provided by any party on the American side. The Canadian delegation waited 35 minutes, conducted an internal deliberation, and reached a decision. They stood up. They collected their documents. They removed their national flags from the table. And they walked out. Mark Carney held a press conference 6 blocks away and delivered 7 words that were trending in 40 countries within 20 minutes. Sovereign nations do not wait to be received. 2 allied leaders have since established punctuality as a public precondition for their own bilateral meetings with Washington. 3 European heads of state issued statements endorsing the underlying principle. The White House has not been able to schedule a replacement session because the conditions Carney set for returning to the table have not been satisfied. Buffett called it the most important negotiation lesson delivered on the world stage in his lifetime, and explained with the directness of a man who has spent 6 decades on both sides of consequential transactions that the willingness to walk away is not a tactical instrument, it is the structural foundation of every negotiation that produces a genuinely fair result. And Carney laid that foundation on the world stage, in front of every camera, in front of every allied government watching, and in front of every future leader who will one day sit in a conference room, watch the clock, and feel the minutes accumulating, and have to decide whether the meeting is worth more than the message that staying sends. Trump arrived 47 minutes late because he believed that controlling the clock meant controlling the room. That making Carney wait was a demonstration of power so established, so consistently reliable, so thoroughly effective against every previous counterpart, that the outcome was already determined before a word was spoken. The Prime Minister of a country 1/10 America's economic scale would remain seated and absorb the delay, because the meeting was too important to walk away from, and the power differential was too pronounced to challenge openly. Instead, Carney demonstrated precisely the thing that 47 minutes of deliberate waiting was designed to prevent the world from seeing. That Canada does not need the meeting more than it needs its dignity. That a nation with real alternatives does not accept being treated as a subordinate. That sovereign nations do not wait to be received. Not for 47 minutes, not for 20, not at all. He walked out, and the empty room communicated everything that needed to be said. 12 chairs pushed back from the table, 6 place settings untouched, 2 flags removed, 1 president standing in a doorway 47 minutes late, discovering that the most powerful office on earth cannot compel a sovereign nation to remain still. He tried to use the clock to establish dominance. The clock established the opposite. The person who arrives late is communicating that the meeting can wait. The person who leaves is communicating that it does not have to happen at all. One of those is a demonstration of power, the other is a demonstration of need. And 47 minutes of deliberate lateness, once met with 35 minutes of composed patience followed by a walk to the door, will never again be capable of looking like power. He controlled the clock, Carney controlled the room, and the room, when it mattered, was empty.